Mhm. Randy's shy today.
All right, folks are coming in right now. We've got 125 participants and they're coming in. Welcome, welcome, everyone. Welcome. All right, President Dudley, whenever you're ready. We have 336 participants with us so far this evening.
Holy moly. All righty. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Teresa Mitchell Dudley, PGCEA President. I want to welcome you to our Designing Educators' Rights to Accommodations under ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act. We are starting off this month of Women's History Month, and I would be remiss if I did not mention one of my heroes, Miss Shirley Chisholm, Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, who started out as an educator in New York and eventually rose to be Congresswoman and the first African-American woman to run for President of the United States. A lot of us know her from her familiar phrases such as unbossed and unbought. And I like the one where she says, if there's no room for you at the table, pull up a folding chair. And I think in this time, you know, I keep that in my mind because the work for public education is ours. And as educators, we've got to be politically active to make sure that our children see the schools that we want to see. And I would be remiss if I did not remind everybody about Wednesday, which will be our celebration in Annapolis of the passing of the override of the Blueprint for Americans' Future. Today, we are very lucky to have with us the Maryland State Education Association General Counsel, Ms. Christy Anderson, along with Assistant General Counsel Damon Felton. Christy is the lead counsel for the entire state, and Damon's region includes Prince George's County. So some of you may have met him previously. And we are going to go ahead and get started. We have a lot of people on the lines. And what we're gonna do today is we want Christy to go through her presentation first, and Damon. And then after they finish their presentation, we will open it up for questions. Many of the questions that you have will be answered in her presentation. So I want you to just be a little patient. And if you have a question that you would like to ask, we have a Q&A feature where you can put your questions in the Q&A box, and Christy can see the Q&A, and as she's going through her presentation, she will be pulling them up. So without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Christy Anderson.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. I am going to pull up my screen here. Okay, so let's kind of jump into this. As an overview, we're going to try and address just reasonable accommodations and leave rights and obviously leave rights generally. Damon will help jump in when it comes to your contractual leave rights. We'll touch on the interactive process, what that is, what it means, and what should be happening if you put in a request for an accommodation. And then we'll just talk generally about some collective approaches of how we can address individual rights in a collective manner. First of all, the Americans with Disabilities Act is a federal law that prohibits discrimination based upon an individual's disability. So it prohibits discrimination in employment. So basically you can't make employment decisions based on somebody's disability. It requires that the employer provide reasonable accommodations and prohibits retaliation against employees for asserting their rights under the law. It is enforced by the EEOC or state agencies like the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights. And those are ultimately the primary agencies that will address that dispute or complaint in the first instance. And then you also, once you go through that process, you will get a right to sue letter for a private lawsuit. There is also a non-discrimination provision as part of Maryland, the education article, which is section 6104 of the education article, that talks about it prohibits discrimination based upon disabilities specifically. And Maryland also has the Fair Employment Practices Act, which is identical to the Americans with Disabilities Act, in large part, a little bit more expansive in some instances, but it's identical in terms of process and expectations and coverage under the law. So the disabilities under COVID, because since we're now operating in a pandemic, a disability is typically defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. It's that definition, and it's a personal physical or mental impairment. So it doesn't cover necessarily if you live with or care for someone who might have a disability. But this ADA has been somewhat expanded since we're operating in a pandemic. The CDC has come out with a list, and we'll talk about that list of underlying health conditions that place you at greater risk of serious illness if you were to be exposed to or contract COVID during this time period. And what the EEOC has said is that if you were one of those individuals that suffers from one of those underlying medical conditions as identified by the CDC, and that list, it's guidelines because that list has changed over the last year. But if you suffer from one of those conditions and you put in a request for accommodations, it is to be treated as a request for accommodations under the ADA. So, and that's only for those that suffer personally from one of those health conditions as identified by the CDC. One thing to note, that age alone does not qualify you for accommodations under the ADA as it's written, and pregnancy alone, neither one of those are considered disabilities under the ADA. Now, pregnancy has gone onto the list. It did not start there, but it is on the list of conditions that places you at greater risk for serious complications if you were to contract COVID. So that is a CDC underlying medical condition for which accommodations should be considered or treated as a request for accommodation in this time period of a pandemic. But the ADA, and this is something that can't be lost in this process because in dealing with several counties right now, ADA does cover mental health issues. So employees that have OCD or anxiety or anything like that that would substantially impair their ability to be effective in the classroom because of the potential exposure to COVID, they are entitled to accommodations under the ADA. But most school systems have bifurcated the process of requesting accommodations. And I don't know if PGCEA is gone or PGCPS has even gone down this route, but most school systems have the process by which you can request accommodations because you have an underlying medical condition as identified by the CDC. And they treat, that's one track to request accommodations, but they still have the traditional ADA request accommodation process and separate forms that you can complete. So if you suffer from a mental condition, you would want to go under the traditional form and the traditional process because that is still a requirement under the law. It is still recognized as a disability and you are still entitled to accommodations, particularly anxiety and some of the OCD, those conditions. In terms of the health conditions that place someone at a higher risk for serious illness, it should be noted that the CDC has two tiers. There's the one that says that you will be at greater risk if you're exposed to COVID. And like I said, since the last time I did this, probably a month or 2 months ago, a month and a half ago, pregnancy was not on the CDC list 6 weeks ago. It is now on that list. But other than that, this list has not changed. But these are the ones that are kind of the automatic. It should be a request for consideration, or the request for accommodations should be considered and determine what would be the most appropriate accommodation, which we'll get into what are appropriate accommodations, because they can vary. It doesn't necessarily mean you'll get the accommodation that is requested. There's also the secondary list that the CDC has put out that indicates that these are conditions that may put someone at higher risk for serious complications. In this particular instance, school systems have generally said, we'll send it over to the principal and we'll let the principal decide whether or not your request can be accommodated based on the needs of your particular school and the situation in that particular building. These are not given the high priority that the primary list has been given, but it is worth noting that there's two different lists that the CDC has put out in terms of their guidelines. So what are ADA accommodations? It is a modification or an adjustment to your work or the work environment that will allow you as an employee to continue to perform the essential functions of your job. And that's really the most important piece of it. It is an accommodation in your current position that allows you to perform those essential job duties. And the ADA requires that the employers provide reasonable accommodations to those qualified individuals unless it's an undue hardship. Defining what exactly is an undue hardship it becomes a legal question. It's a higher bar in terms of the ADA as compared to when we talk about the vaccines, like Title VII and religious accommodations. It's a very low bar in that case. But it's hard to challenge the employer's determination about reasonable accommodations, as long as they have done all that they're supposed to do in leading up to making that determination. And that's some of what we'll talk about. But in terms of possible accommodations, it could be additional PPE, the personal protective equipment. It could be plexiglass. It could be additional cleaning. It could be giving you an air filter, as long as it has a HEPA filter in it, in particular, an air purifier with a HEPA filter. Would be sufficient in some instances. It could include a transfer to a vacant position. They do not have to create a position for you as an accommodation. Telework is an option, or remote work, and leave is also a reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So there's all kinds of possibilities out there. We have seen in some school systems where they have, in order to reduce exposure to other individuals, either reducing the individuals that you would have to interact with, or having you in one location and still having you teach remote, but you would be isolated somewhat in that other location where you would have very few people going in and out, and certainly no students, but they would expect you still to report to the building. Those have been accommodations that have been put out there, and that's not uncommon. And the plexiglass is another situation where we've seen more and more where they've opted to put in place some plexiglass to create some of those barriers in order to make sure that there's some protections between you and the students, where that 6 feet of social distancing, it's hard to sit next to a student to instruct if you have to do hand over hand. In some instances, they're encouraging the plexiglass in between and demonstrating, but you're sitting right next to the student, but there's some protection there. But it requires an individual analysis. And we often get the question about educators with high-risk family members, where you live with or you care for someone who has one of those underlying health conditions that places them at serious risk if they are exposed to COVID. And unfortunately, the ADA does not provide any protections for family members. And so there's not any obligation on the part of the employer to provide those accommodations. There is legislation in the General Assembly currently that would prevent the school system from retaliating, and would provide additional protections for those individuals who live with or care for someone who has an underlying health condition, who are over the age of 65, and are not fully vaccinated. They would be precluded from retaliating from those individuals, and it provides a provision that where it's appropriate, telework should be offered to the extent practicable. That's House Bill 1322, which is, I think, up for hearing this week.
We'll be
So we are-
testifying in favor of that bill on Wednesday.
Yes, so we are definitely in support of that, to help move this process along and provide those additional protections to expand those the ADA protections essentially, to that class of individuals and employees. So the other possible solutions would be leave. There's possibility of FMLA leave, or just a general leave under the collective bargaining agreement. There's several different varieties that might be a possibility in those instances. But that's a tougher class of individuals to address. But this legislation would make it much, much easier. There's also some questions around vaccines and whether or not, one, can the school system mandate it? The answer is there's no federal law that would preclude them from mandating it. The state law would require the school system to negotiate it. If they were going to mandate it in any way, shape, or form, it would have to be a subject of negotiations. But right now in the state, they are not mandating vaccines. It is purely voluntary. But there's still this question of, if it were to become mandated, are there exceptions? And the exceptions really are if there's a medical basis it's contraindicated. So you suffer from an underlying health condition. It could be allergies, it could be asthma, it could be something that would, because of the medication or the elements that are used to create the vaccine, could interact negatively with an allergy. So if it's medically contraindicated, then there's obviously ADA accommodations if it were ever to become mandated, that the school system would still have to provide you with some additional protections and ADA accommodations to some extent. This happens in the hospitals where you have nurses who are frequently required to get the flu vaccine every single year. And there are those, because that's mandated and it's in statute, there are those who have ADA accommodations. They have to wear masks. They have to do certain other things. Their schedule might be different, or they might stagger or place them on a shift where they reduce their interactions. So there's all kinds of different accommodations that can and have taken place, and the medical field is an example of that. The other is a Title VII. It requires that an employer reasonably accommodate sincerely held religious beliefs. And while no school system is going to challenge an individual on their sincerely held religious beliefs, generally speaking, they are going to be able to deny that accommodation on the undue hardship, because the employer is required to provide a healthy and safe work environment, and having someone unvaccinated could create an undue hardship for the employer. So in that instance, Title VII is not something that anyone will likely prevail upon. But the ADA, again, it's that reasonable accommodation unless it's an undue hardship to eliminate that risk. And it does require that the employer would have to demonstrate that in providing the proposed accommodation, it poses a significant difficulty or expense. And so that's a pretty high bar for an employer to meet in those instances. So at least with the accommodation piece, there's more of a compelling piece for the employer to try and work out and find a reasonable accommodation that meets the needs of the employer as well as the employee in those instances. And in terms of reasonable accommodations, and I kind of touched on this, reasonable accommodations for a vaccine is essentially waiting till another vaccine becomes available, where it's not going to trigger those negative reactions, health reactions. Additional PPE, modified work schedules, could be that they're just going to require you to go through a screening process every morning to look for symptoms that might be, it's a symptom screening for COVID. And obviously there's also the testing screening it's supposed to be becoming more readily available, but I don't see that being implemented in the school system, although it might be, and that could be an accommodation as well. When you request an accommodation, it doesn't require any magic words. It doesn't necessarily require any medical documentation. You just have to put the employer on notice that you are in need of, and like I said, that you have a condition, and sometimes it's a physical, it's obvious, and the employer should engage in the process and determine a reasonable accommodation where it's an outwardly obvious need. In the case of the underlying health conditions as identified by the CDC, it is more likely than not, even if you put your employer on notice that you're going to need accommodations, they're going to need medical certification of some sort to verify that you do in fact suffer from that underlying health condition, because it's not otherwise obvious. And you've been working possibly for the employer for 10 years and you've had that condition for 10 years and it's not in any way inhibited or impaired your ability to perform the essential functions of your job. So especially when we're talking about those underlying health conditions as identified by the CDC, you are going to have to follow up and get the medical documentation. But once the employer is on notice, they have to consider the request on an individual basis, and they have to engage in what is referred to as the interactive process. And that's you and the employer talking about what is a reasonable accommodation. In that, they're supposed to enter this process. It's based on the individual, and they're supposed to enter that process in good faith. It's not supposed to be adversarial, but we do encourage you can bring in a representative to sit with you and to make sure that there is that appropriate engagement, but there should be some collaborative problem-solving exercise to determine what is a reasonable accommodation given your situation. Because of the number of requests in other counties, this is why they have just said, look, if you're on that top tier list, as identified by the CDC, we're just going to grant you whatever accommodation you requested. And we're not even going to engage you in the interactive process because they have hundreds of applications sitting out there and they don't have anywhere near the manpower to deal with it. So in that regard, I do encourage you to get those applications in early so that before your date comes up, hopefully you will have had it considered and it all be worked out, and you're not working from day to day, not knowing whether are you teaching, are you teleworking, are you being directed back into the building and you're going to have to take sick leave. I mean, you need some stability. Everybody needs some stability during this period of time. And so get the applications in early so that this interactive process can in fact take place. And you should be willing to share information with the school system. It doesn't require, you're the expert. It's your underlying health condition. And you, in consultation with your doctor, know very well the risk that you will be facing if you are subjected to or potentially exposed to COVID. And so this is an opportunity for you to share those concerns with the employer to find a reasonable accommodation. And in the event that your requested accommodation is denied, just denied outright, you need to ask them why, because they can be required to provide you with a specific basis for denying those accommodations. But the other thing is, we need to know, the association needs to know, because if the school system is giving blanket denials, then they're not engaging in the interactive process in good faith. And we need to address that. If they're just blanketly denying all requests for telework, then we need to deal with that. But we need to know in order to address it, because that is going to be a huge problem, because telework is, even by the virtue of the CDC guidance, supposed to be considered as a viable option. And clearly in the last year, you have demonstrated it is possible. And the bottom line is you're not going to have 100% of your kids return. They can't possibly return and physically distance in the building. So if there's going to be lots of opportunities for virtual instruction and for that to continue through the end of the year. So there's not, and just to be clear, this interactive process, it could be a telephone call. It doesn't mean that you're sitting in a face-to-face meeting or a face-to-face Zoom meeting to talk about those accommodations. I mean, it could be very, very informal. It could be an exchange of emails, which is really kind of hard to be interactive through email. But it should be at least a telephone call where you have an opportunity to respond to their concerns, and the employer has an opportunity to properly assess what would be the best accommodation for you in that process. And this again is the medical documentation. The school system can ask for that documentation. It does not have to be by a particular doctor. It's just got to be an appropriate, it doesn't have to be a doctor. Let me start off by saying that. It has to be an appropriate healthcare or rehabilitation professional, because I've seen physical therapists submit notes, and that's acceptable under the ADA. It is, but this is particularly true for those underlying health conditions because they are not otherwise obvious. And the employer can come back and ask for additional questions, so long as it's related to the request for an accommodation. They can ask for additional clarification or questions around that particular condition. They are not entitled to your complete medical file. Let's be clear. And any information that you provide has to be maintained and it has to be confidential. So these are all the interactive process, and everything about the interactive process is individualized. The assessments and determining the appropriateness of the accommodations, it's individualized. So one of the things that through the association, through working through the association, there's an opportunity to use like the association for collective action. For example, if you're getting blanket denials, we need to know about that because collectively we as the association can deal with that. We can coordinate some of these requests on a large volume. We can make suggestions in terms of their process, especially based on experiences in other counties. It's an opportunity for the association to see, but it helps for us to know, especially if you've already been starting through this process. As members go through this process, we need to know how they're treating them, what they call the interactive process. Is the interactive process occurring? We don't know the answer to these questions. And so we can help shape that process. So the more information that we know, or the more information that is shared with us, then the more input that we might have on improving what process they do have. And it might be that they just don't have much of a process. So it really is an opportunity for us to shape it. So that's kind of in a nutshell. It's fast. I went through some of this quickly, and it was hard to look at the screen and answer questions.
Hi, Christy. I'm here. I'm listening to you. That we have some questions that people have their hands raised, and we also have some questions in the Q&A. So what I'm going to do is kind of popcorn back and forth. But
Okay.
The first thing I do want to tell everyone, if you want to apply for accommodations, you must apply for accommodations with a 4176 form. The form is located on our website. I believe Josh and Brianna have done a great job in putting it on the PGCEA website, right on the landing page so that you can find it. And they're going to put it in the chat as well. All of your accommodations should go to requests. First of all, read the paperwork, right? You know, we always tell our children, make sure you read all of the directions before you start the test. Read all the directions, fill out the form completely, and you're going to submit it. There it goes. Boom. You're going to send it to Amana Simmons. Amana, AMANA.Simmons@pgcps.org. Now, how long is it going to take for these to get completed? A long time. And I'm not trying to be smart, and I don't mean it'll take 200 years because clearly we don't have 200 years, but I think that we should be realistic about it. Some of you have already put in for accommodations and you have been told that they were waiting until they found out exactly when we were going back to school, because some people's accommodations change. For example, if you had surgery on your leg last year and you couldn't come back in the springtime, but in the fall you were able to come back. However, you might have some accommodations that maybe you can't walk upstairs because your leg is still hurting you a little bit. So those are the accommodations. Now, there are other questions that I saw and I want to get to them, but understand that getting an accommodation and getting accommodations, as Christy said, is not always going to be what you think it's going to be. It's going to be what the school system recommends. Now, there have been times that I have been called into a school where the principal has tried to make accommodations for someone that were just crazy. And we were able to go in and intervene, and we were able to push a little bit to get that person an accommodation that really met the needs a little bit better. Because I saw somebody type in the chat, who approves your accommodations? Amanda Simmons approves whether or not accommodations can be made for you. The actual accommodations will be made in the building when you get there with your principal, and then they have to report back to Amanda Simmons. So, and sometimes the principals might say, well, I can't do that, or I'm not going to do that. Well, that's a whole nother conversation about crazy, and we can work on those things. But the most important thing for you to know is that if somebody says no to your accommodation, you have the opportunity to appeal as well. Okay. And Gary Brennan just put in the chat, a completed request for accommodation should be sent to amanda.simmons@pgcps.org. So I did see some raised hands, and I want to go to, can we pull Jeanette Johnson up? I got Jeanette Johnson, Cassandra Moses. People are jumping back off and coming back on. Raise your hand and keep it up if you have a question. Cassandra Moses, you have to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much.
And speak up, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for taking my question. I had put my hand down because I was didn't want to ask something that had already been done. But once we fill out this form and we turn it into Ms. Simmons, is it then given to our principals at the school level?
Yes.
No,
Okay.
the actual form is not given to the principal. What should be given to the principal, because anything you submit is confidential. It should be treated as confidential medical information. But what should be given to the principal is, this is an individual who submitted for accommodations. We've approved accommodation. This is her requested accommodation, but you need to work it out to see if that's even possible. So if you submitted a form for an underlying medical condition, you're in the top tier as identified by the CDC, and you requested telework.
Okay.
Because you have a compromised immune system. The school system initially, central office should make the determination based on your form. You qualify for accommodations. Kick it over to the principal. Your name should be on a list of requested accommodations, telework, and then they need to work out with you. The principal needs to work out with you what is an appropriate accommodation, what will work in their building. And some principals, and there's a lot of inequities there because principals are, in some instances, being very flexible and allowing a lot of telework. Other instances, they're not. And then I've got other counties where they're just saying at the county level, we're not doing telework. So find something else, work it out, but find something else. So it just varies from county to county. We'll have to see what happens, but it's the principal that talks about the appropriate accommodation, but it's not based on your form. It should just be your name on a list and your requested accommodation.
But the accommodations office does alert the principal that you have an accommodation. I think that was what I said yes to. I wasn't saying yes to the other piece that you talked about, Christy.
Yeah, I just thought when she asked, will they see the form? And the answer is they will not see your form. The principal will not see the form. Central office will only, they retain the form.
Okay, I have a question from the Q&A. What is the legally binding turnaround time for an employer to provide reasonable accommodations? Is there a time frame?
We're in extenuating circumstances, and unfortunately it's a pandemic, and so no, there is no time frame. I mean, even FMLA, there are some, in the regulations, they provide timeframes of 5 days, but it says without extenuating circumstances, it should be 5 days. Honestly, no employer is meeting that timeline, and it's just, there's so many exceptions because we're operating under state of emergency and so much has been suspended. So the short answer is no.
Now, may I interject? Amanda Simmons has alerted us that she is going to try and get almost any sort of applications that are in sort of process before March 17th. That said, there are several hundred applications already in and more coming in. So it's not maybe altogether realistic that everybody's going to hear, but as soon as possible, they're trying to work them through. But she's kind of like a one person, maybe two person shop, if you will. But she says she is steadily working on them.
Yeah.
And I'll just say that that goes to the sooner you get it in, the better. If you put it in 2 days before you're due back, the chances
Not here.
done is slim to none.
Yeah.
So try to get your forms in as soon as possible. Okay. Esther Olabara, Shauna Lee. Go ahead, Esther.
Hi, good afternoon, or evening. Yeah, one of my questions, she had said something about 65 and older at risk of something. I missed that part, but my other question is,
Now, Esther, you can't be bogarting the questions here today. I'm
what?
kidding. I'm kidding. Go ahead. Let's do one question at a time. Christy,
Okay, I don't know
the
if I heard
65 and
that
older.
one.
Don't go away, Esther. I got you.
Okay.
Christy.
Technically, age is not a disability under the law, and it is
Yeah,
not protected by the ADA. But we do have some legislation that would extend some protections to those that are 65 and have not been fully inoculated.
Okay.
So there would be some protections under that House Bill 1322.
And Esther, I'm looking at your picture. You are not 65. What's your second question?
It was I tend to have anxiety, respiratory issues, and then all the underlying situations, high blood pressure. I didn't know about this accommodation until I saw the email today, and I'm like, wow, I've had anxiety about really going back and wearing mask the whole day with breathing issue and blood pressure and pre-diabetes. So I'm worried about that. Is that something that somebody can take a chance and apply for some accommodations for?
My suggestion to you, Esther, is to go see your primary care physician and fill out the accommodation form. If accommodations can be made for you based on what your medical provider says, Christy, am I right?
Correct.
Okay.
I mean, and if it's for anxiety, then you're going to be filling out the regular traditional ADA accommodations, because that should be treated as it's a mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. So you would want to do that more the traditional route and not necessarily under the CDC identified underlying health conditions, because there's a little bit of a difference there. And so I just want to make sure that, there's most school systems have bifurcated the ADA process, the traditional route, and then the CDC underlying health conditions.
Christy, I don't know what bifurcated means.
They basically, they have two routes. I mean, they've got a traditional route and then they've got a CDC medical condition route. And if you're going to do anxiety or a mental impairment, it would be more the traditional route. But they can't ignore that route. I do have school systems that are ignoring that route, and it's a bit problematic, but they can't ignore it. And so if you have to circle back and get some assistance from the association, then that's exactly why we're here. And we would make sure that those accommodations get moved. That's probably the best route to go in terms of accommodations in that instance.
If you're not sure, fill out the form.
Mhm.
Jerry Mohammed asks, I would have to bring my 3 asthmatic children to work with me to teach, since they have no before or after care. Further, I have 2 of the serious risk health conditions and 1 that may cause blank, blank, blank. Would I complete a form for all 3 conditions or no?
She would actually only complete the form for her personal underlying health condition, not her children, because again, the ADA does not cover children that you live with or care for. It is strictly for your personal condition. And so the best way to get a response, and a positive response, hopefully, in terms of accommodations, would be to fill out the forms for your personal health condition.
And here's another quick one I'm gonna take out of Q&A, and then I'm gonna go to Shauna Lee. If a person uses FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, are they covered under the sick leave bank?
Sick leave bank only covers a personal illness.
Right.
And whereas FMLA is really used for, it could be a serious or personal illness, but it's typically FMLA in this instance, as we're talking about the pandemic related issues, FMLA has been utilized in those situations where you care for or live with someone who has an underlying medical condition that places them at high risk. So as long as it's a serious personal illness, the sick leave bank might cover the situation, but the rules are in the collective bargaining agreement. And the local would be best suited to answer that specific question. There is a committee that makes a determination as to whether or not it's a qualifying event for the sick leave bank.
There is, and our sick leave bank coordinator just so happens to be on the line. Melissa,
I'm
did
here.
you hear the question?
Yes.
Do you want
So
to
the
answer
fir-
it or no?